picture this. You're in the Neander Valley. It's 1856 near Dusseldorf. And you stumble upon some really strange bones.
It's a place that's kind of become like a Paleolithic theme park now. You've got the Neanderthal Museum, Neanderthal brand beer.
Yeah, like a whole tourist destination.
And you can even go to this thing called the morphing station where they'll like digitally morph your face with Neanderthal features.
I saw that online. It's pretty wild.
It's kind of ironic, though, because the actual limestone cliffs where they found those first Neanderthal bones are completely gone, quarried away.
All gone. So it makes you wonder, who were these Neanderthals, really? What were they like?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. We're going to really try to understand the Neanderthals through all this amazing material we've got. We'll cover their discovery, the science behind their DNA, how they compare to us and other apes, and even why they disappeared.
It's fascinating.
It really is. The goal here is to go way beyond that, the typical caveman image and really uncover some surprising truths about these ancient relatives of ours.
I'm ready to have my mind blown.
Me too.
So let's start at the beginning, back in 1856, with that discovery of the first Neanderthal bones. Can you imagine the confusion?
Oh, absolutely. People had no idea what to make of these bones. They were tossing out all sorts of theories.
Like what?
Well, some thought they were from a cave there. Big bones in a cave seems logical enough.
Makes sense.
Others thought it might be like a really, really old human, like a primitive member of our race, which is closer but still very vague.
Right.
And then there were some truly out there ideas. Like one theory was that it was a diseased Cossack soldier from the Napoleonic Wars.
A Cossack.
Yeah, the idea was he wandered off and his legs were bowed from years of riding. So they thought maybe that's what the bones were.
Wow, that's quite a leap.
There was even a theory that it was a spelunker with rickets. Someone who explored caves and had a bone disease.
So basically they had no clue.
Pretty much. But you got to give him credit for creativity, at least.
For sure. But looking back, it's fascinating to see how new scientific discoveries are often interpreted through the lens of what people already know or believe.
Exactly. And in this case, one of the biggest challenges for those early scientists was the size of the Neanderthal skull.
What do you mean?
Well, the skull was large. Really large. And at that time, the prevailing thought about evolution was that brain size gradually increased over time leading up to modern humans.
So the big Neanderthal skull didn't fit that narrative.
Not exactly. You see, Neanderthals had brains that were just as big as ours, even if they were shaped differently. And that threw a wrench into their understanding of human evolution.
So even Darwin didn't really know what to make of Neanderthals.
He mentioned them in The Descent of Man, but he mostly just acknowledged that they had large cranial capacity. He didn't really delve into it much further.
So then how do we get to that classic image of the hunched-over, brutish caveman?
Well, that's largely thanks to a guy named Marcellin Boule, a French paleontologist in the early 1900s. He studied a pretty famous Neanderthal skeleton called the La Chapelle aux Cinq skeleton, and he basically concluded that Neanderthals were stooped, bent-kneed, and not very intelligent.
That's the image most people still have in their heads.
I know, right? It stuck with us for over a century. But the thing is, Boule's interpretation was flawed. He even described their skeletal structure as having a distinctly simian arrangement, meaning ape-like. And he went on to say their mental functions were purely vegetative or bestial.
Wow, so not very flattering.
Not at all. And as we know now, completely inaccurate.
So how did his interpretation become so influential?
Well, he was a respected scientist at the time, and his work really shaped the public perception of Neanderthals for decades. It's a prime example of how a single influential interpretation, even if it's wrong, can have a lasting impact.
It's a good reminder that science is always evolving, and we should always be questioning and reevaluating our understanding.
Couldn't agree more. And thankfully, science did correct itself. In the 1950s, scientists like William Strauss and A.J.E. Cave took another look at that La Chapelle aux Cinq skeleton that Boule had studied.
And what did they find?
They realized that the stooped posture Boule had described was likely due to severe arthritis. The individual had a deformed spine and other skeletal problems that would have affected their posture. They even said that if you took a Neanderthal, cleaned them up, gave them a shave, put them in a suit, they might blend right in on the New York subway.
Wow, that's a powerful image. It really challenges that old stereotype.
It does, and it highlights how important it is to re-examine evidence with fresh eyes as our understanding of science progresses.
So around the same time, you have Ralph Selecki excavating Shanidar Cave in Iraq in the 1950s and 60s, and he starts to uncover evidence that paints a more nuanced picture of Neanderthals.
Absolutely. Selecki found skeletons at Shanidar that suggested Neanderthals had a much more complex social structure than we previously thought. For example, he found a skeleton of an individual with multiple healed injuries. This individual would have needed significant care from others to survive.
So they weren't just solitary brutes.
Not at all. They were clearly taking care of their sick and injured. And then there was the famous Neander IV burial, where pollen analysis initially suggested that flowers had been placed on the grave. This led to speculation that Neanderthals might have had rituals or beliefs surrounding death and perhaps even a concept of an afterlife.
So they may have had some capacity for symbolic thought.
That was the thinking at the time. Although the flower burial interpretation has been debated since then. The evidence for caregiving at Neander is still significant. It challenges that old view of them as uncaring and brutish.
It's amazing how much our understanding of Neanderthals has changed. And it seems like a lot of those misconceptions stemmed from misinterpretations of the skeletal evidence.
Definitely. But then a true revolution happened when scientists were finally able to extract and analyze Neanderthal DNA. That's when things really started to change.
Yeah, Svante Pääbo.
Exactly. Pääbo is a Swedish geneticist who's considered the pioneer of paleogenetics. He worked at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Germany, and his work has completely transformed our understanding of human evolution.
So what did Pääbo do exactly?
Well, he started out by extracting ancient DNA from Egyptian mummies, which was groundbreaking in itself. But his real ambition was to sequence the entire Neanderthal genome to read their genetic blueprint.
That must have been incredibly challenging.
Oh, it was. You have to understand that DNA degrades over time. It breaks down into tiny fragments. So trying to piece together a complete genome from ancient remains is like trying to reassemble a shredded Manhattan phone book that's been sitting in a landfill for thousands of years.
That's an impossible task.
It seemed that way. But Pääbo and his team were determined. They developed all sorts of ingenious techniques to extract, amplify, and sequence those tiny DNA fragments. They were really pushing the boundaries of what was possible.
So when did they announce this ambitious project?
In 2006, which was the 150th anniversary of the discovery of the first Neanderthal remains. So it was perfect timing.
I bet the scientific community was buzzing.
Oh, yeah. And as they started to get usable data, a huge surprise emerged. It was a discovery made by David Reich, a geneticist at Harvard who was collaborating with Pääbo.
What did they find?
They found that the Neanderthal genome was more similar to the DNA of present-day Europeans and Asians than it was to the DNA of Africans.
So that means Neanderthals were more closely related to some modern humans than others.
Exactly. And this finding really shook things up because it directly challenged the prevailing theory of human origins at the time.
You're talking about the out-of-Africa theory.
Exactly. That theory proposed that modern humans originated in Africa and then spread across the world, replacing other archaic human populations like Neanderthals with little or no interbreeding. So the idea was that all modern humans should be equally distantly related to Neanderthals. But the genetic data was telling a different story.
So how did they explain this discrepancy?
Well, at first they thought maybe their samples were contaminated with modern human DNA. It's always a concern when you're working with ancient DNA, but they ran all sorts of tests and controls, and the results kept coming back the same. There was a genuine genetic link between Neanderthals and non-African populations.
So they had to come up with a new explanation.
They did. They proposed what they called the leaky replacement hypothesis.
Leaky replacement.
Yeah, it's a bit of a funny name, but it basically means that as modern humans migrated out of Africa, they encountered Neanderthals in the Middle East and they interbred. And then the offspring of those unions carried some Neanderthal DNA into Europe and Asia as they continued to spread.
So it wasn't a complete replacement, but more like a partial replacement with some mixing thrown in.
Exactly. And this leaky replacement model is now the most widely accepted explanation for the pattern of Neanderthal DNA we see in modern humans.
And what's amazing is that this means if you have ancestry from outside of Africa, you likely carry some Neanderthal DNA within you.
That's right. It's estimated that most non-Africans have between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genome.
Wow, that's incredible. It really changes how we think about Neanderthals. They're not just some extinct species. They're part of our family history.
And it brings up a really interesting question. If we were closely related enough to interbreed, why did Neanderthals eventually disappear while we thrive?
Yeah, what was it about us that allowed us to survive and ultimately dominate the planet?
That's one of the biggest mysteries in human evolution. And to understand it, we need to compare Neanderthals to both our direct ancestors and to our closest living relatives, the great apes. We need to look at their cognitive abilities, their behaviors, and their culture.
So where do we start?
Well, one place to start is with experiments that compare the cognitive abilities of great apes to those of human children. Paabo himself is cautious about speculating too much about Neanderthal capabilities, especially things like language. But by looking at our closest living relatives, we can get some insights into the evolution of human cognition.
So tell me about these experiments.
Well, there's a research facility at the Leipzig Zoo called Pongoland, where they study the cognitive abilities of orangutans. They have these elaborate puzzle boxes, and they see how the orangutans figure out how to get the reward inside.
So how do they do?
They do pretty well. One orangutan named Dokana was particularly adept at solving these puzzles. She figured out how to use tools to retrieve the reward, and she even displayed something called displacement behavior, which is a sign of advanced problem-solving skills.
What's displacement behavior?
It's basically when an animal does something seemingly unrelated to the task at hand as a way to deal with frustration or anticipation. So in Dokana's case, she would spit water into a tube to raise the level of a peanut that was floating inside.
That's clever.
Right, it shows a level of abstract thinking that's pretty impressive.
So how do human children compare to the orangutans in these tasks?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Sometimes the children actually struggle more than the apes initially, especially with the more complex puzzles.
Really?
Yeah. But when you look at a broader range of cognitive abilities, apes and young children perform similarly when it comes to understanding the physical world, things like quantity causality and spatial reasoning.
So where's the difference?
The difference seems to lie in the social realm. Human children are much better at understanding social cues like pointing and gaze following, and they're much more adept at imitating the actions of others.
So it's about social intelligence.
Exactly. And there's a really interesting observation by a psychologist named Michael Tomasello. He argues that one of the key differences between humans and other primates is our capacity for shared intentionality.
Shared intentionality, what's that?
It's basically the ability to understand that others have intentions and goals and to coordinate our own actions with theirs. It's what allows us to work together collaboratively towards a common goal. Tomasello has done a lot of research comparing chimps to human children, and he's found that chimps just don't seem to get this concept of shared intentionality. They don't engage in the same kind of cooperative activities that even young children do.
So you're saying that this ability to put our heads together, to collaborate, and to share intentions might be what gave us an edge over Neanderthals.
It's certainly a possibility. And when we look at the archaeological record, we see some hints that might support this idea.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, Neanderthals were incredibly tough. They had thick bones and robust skeletons, which tells us they lived a physically demanding life. They were clearly skilled hunters and tool makers. But their stone tool technology remained relatively static for tens of thousands of years.
Meaning they didn't innovate as much as our direct ancestors.
Exactly. And that could point to a difference in cognitive flexibility or maybe a lack of that collaborative innovation that we see in modern humans.
We also see evidence that Neanderthals buried their dead right.
We do, and that suggests some level of ritual or belief system. It's a sign of complex thought.
But there's also evidence of cannibalism at some Neanderthal sites.
There is, although it's still debated what that cannibalism meant. Was it purely for survival, or was there something more ritualistic going on? We don't really know for sure.
It's a big grim either way.
It is, but it's also a reminder that Neanderthals were facing incredibly harsh conditions. They were living in Ice Age Europe, competing for resources with other predators. And sometimes survival meant doing things that we might find abhorrent today.
So they were tough, but they were also capable of compassion. We see evidence of that in the healed injuries on their skeletons.
Absolutely. The original Neanderthal specimen, the one found in the Neander Valley, had a healed fracture in its arm. And the La Chapelle-Essence skeleton had signs of multiple healed injuries, including a broken hip and a damaged knee. These individuals would have needed help from others to survive.
So they were taking care of their sick and injured, just like the individuals at Shannon Cave.
Exactly. It shows that they had empathy and a sense of community.
And then there's the interesting difference in their patterns of dispersal. Neanderthals seem to have stayed mostly on land, while our direct ancestors were venturing out across open water.
That's a really intriguing point. Neanderthals didn't seem to cross large bodies of water very often. Their remains are found mostly in Europe and parts of Asia. But early modern humans were crossing seas and oceans even during the Ice Age.
Like the journey to Australia.
Exactly. That was a remarkable feat of seafaring, and it shows a willingness to explore and colonize new territories that seems to have been unique to our species.
So why the difference?
Well, Paabo has this interesting idea. He calls it a madness or a Faustian restlessness. He thinks that there might be something in our genes that drives us to explore and innovate, to push the boundaries of what's possible.
A Faustian gene.
Yeah, it's a metaphor, of course.
Yeah.
But he's serious about trying to find the genetic basis for this uniquely human trait.
That would be an incredible discovery.
It would. And it would help us understand why we're the only species that's colonized every corner of the globe.
So where did the Denisovans and the hobbits fit into all of this?
Ah, yes. Our newly discovered cousins? The Denisovans were a complete surprise. They were identified from just a finger bone and a molar found in a cave in Siberia in 2008.
And what did the DNA tell us?
It told us that they were a distinct group of hominids that were more closely related to Neanderthals than to us. And, get this, modern humans interbred with Denisovans too.
Really?
Yeah, people living in Melanesia and parts of Southeast Asia today carry Denisovan DNA in their genomes. Some populations have up to 6% Denisovan ancestry.
That's amazing. So we were interbreeding with multiple different hominid groups.
It seems that way. And then there are the hobbits, Homo floresiensis. They were discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores in 2003, and they were tiny. They stood only about 3 feet tall and had really small brains.
Like hobbits from the Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. That's where they got their nickname. It's been hard to extract DNA from hobbit remains, but the evidence suggests that they were a distinct species of human that lived until relatively recently, maybe as recently as 50,000 years ago.
So our family tree is getting more and more complex.
It definitely is. It's not a simple linear progression from ape to human. It's more like a branching bush with lots of different twigs and branches.
And it makes you wonder why all these other hominid groups went extinct while we survived.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some scientists think that it might have to do with reproductive rates. Neanderthals and Denisovans probably had longer gestation periods and lower birth rates than early modern humans. So even a slight decrease in their population could have had a significant impact on their long-term survival.
And that's especially relevant today when you consider the plight of our remaining great ape cousins.
It is. All the great apes except for humans are critically endangered. Their populations are dwindling due to habitat loss, poaching, and disease. So the same pressures that might have contributed to the extinction of other hominid groups are now threatening the survival of our closest living relatives.
That's a sobering thought.
It is, but it's also a reminder of how interconnected we are with the rest of the natural world, and how important it is to protect the biodiversity of our planet.
Speaking of interconnectedness, let's talk about La Ferracie, a really important archaeological site in France.
Ah, La Ferracie. It's a treasure trove of Neanderthal remains. They found skeletons of adults, children, even infants there. It's one of the most complete Neanderthal fossil records we have.
And what have we learned from La Ferracie?
Well, we've learned a lot about their lifestyle, their diet, their social structure. We've even found evidence of symbolic behavior there.
What kind of symbolic behavior?
Well, one of the most intriguing finds is a hand axe that's about 70,000 years old. It's remarkably symmetrical, and some archaeologists have argued that it shows a sense of aesthetics, a desire to create something beautiful.
So they weren't just pragmatically making tools, they were also thinking about form and beauty.
It's possible, but we have to be careful about projecting our own values onto the past. Just because we see beauty in something doesn't mean that a Neanderthal saw it the same way.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
We have to be careful about imposing our own interpretations on the archaeological record.
We do. And when you look at the broader picture, the evidence for symbolic behavior in Neanderthals is still relatively sparse. They didn't create cave art or elaborate personal ornaments like our direct ancestors did.
So that might be a key difference between us and them.
It might. The ability to think symbolically, to create art and language and complex culture might have been what allowed us to dominate the planet while Neanderthals and other hominid groups went extinct.
And it all comes back to that Faustian gene that Pavel was talking about, that drive to explore, to create, to innovate.
Maybe so. It's a fascinating idea and one that's worth exploring further.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners?
I think the main takeaway is that Neanderthals were much more complex than we used to think. They were intelligent, adaptable, and resourceful. They cared for their sick and injured. They buried their dead. And they were even capable of interbreeding with our direct ancestors.
They were humans just like us in many ways.
They were. And their story is a reminder that our own evolutionary journey is much more complicated and intertwined than we often realize.
It also makes you think about what it means to be human and what our responsibility is to the other species we share this planet with.
Absolutely. If the Neanderthals could disappear, what does that say about our own species' ability to both create and destroy?
It's a question worth pondering, and we encourage our listeners to keep exploring, to learn more about our ancient past, and to use that knowledge to help us build a better future.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey.
It has. And I'm sure we'll be revisiting this topic again soon. There's always more to learn.
That's the beauty of science. It's a never-ending quest for knowledge.
I couldn't agree more.